Elena Voss adjusted the collar of her emerald green gown, her fingers trembling as she stepped into the Maison de Lune. The ballroom was a gilded nightmare, every mirror and chandelier reflecting the grotesque opulence of the host, Lord Duval. She had agreed to this masquerade only to secure a favor from the aristocracy. Now, as the music swelled and the guests twirled in their elaborate costumes, she felt like a ghost haunting a place that had no use for her. Her eyes flicked to the entrance, where a figure stood alone, his silhouette sharp against the candlelight. Luca Moretti. His coat was black, his posture rigid, and his gaze, icy blue, locked onto her like a blade at her throat. She turned away, but the sound of his footsteps echoed behind her. "You're late, Miss Voss," he said, his voice a velvet threat. The music stopped. All eyes turned. She had no choice but to face him. "I was never invited," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. His smile was a wound. "Then you're here as a trespasser." The room held its breath. Somewhere, a sword clattered to the floor. Elena slipped into the corridor, her pulse a war drum in her ears. The ballroom's opulence faded behind her, replaced by the sterile chill of the passageway. She pressed her back against the wall, breathing shallowly, but the sound of Luca's footsteps grew louder. He was coming. She could feel it. "You're running from me, Miss Voss?" His voice was a whisper, as if he were behind her. She spun around, but the corridor was empty. "You're not as brave as you pretend," he said, stepping into the light. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned. "You think you can play games with me? I've watched you for weeks." Her breath caught. "What are you talking about?" "Every move you've made. Every debt you've tried to bury." "I'm not here for the ball, Elena. I'm here for you." Her stomach dropped. "You don't know me." "Oh, I know you well enough to know that you're terrified of what you want." He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "And I'm tired of you running." She turned to flee, but he caught her wrist, his grip like iron. "Let go of me. Not until you promise me something." His voice dropped to a growl. "Promise me you'll stop running." The corridor seemed to close in around them. Somewhere behind her, the ballroom's music resumed, but she could hear nothing but the pounding of her heart. The cab rolled to a stop outside her building, its doors swinging open with a hiss. Elena stepped out, her heels clicking on the gravel as she stared at the black car parked beside her. Her breath hitched. Luca Moretti was here. She had no idea how he had found her address, but the sight of his silhouette in the driver's seat sent a shiver down her spine. The door of the car opened, and he stepped out, his coat flaring in the wind. "You're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you I'd find you," he replied, his eyes dark with something she couldn't name. "You think you can disappear? I've spent years hunting ghosts, Elena. And you're the one I never expected to find." She took a step back, her heart hammering. "This isn't your fight. Is it not?" He moved closer, his presence a storm. "You owe me a debt, and I intend to collect." "I don't owe you anything. You owe me your life." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Somewhere inside her, something cracked. She turned and ran, but his voice followed her, low and certain. "You'll come back, Elena. I'll make sure of it." The door of her apartment slammed shut behind her, but the echo of his words lingered. She could not stop thinking about him. Elena's fingers curled around the doorframe of her apartment as if it might anchor her to reality. Luca's car still idled outside, its engine a low growl that mirrored the storm in her chest. She had no choice but to confront him. When the doorbell rang again, she opened it to find Luca standing there, his silhouette sharp against the night, a single envelope in his hand. "Your father's last letter," he said, voice like a blade. She followed him into the study, her heels clicking against the parquet floor. The room was a cathedral of power, mahogany bookshelves, a grand piano, and a fireplace that had not burned in years. Luca gestured to a chair, but his eyes never left her. "You're wasting your time," she said, but her voice wavered. He slid a photograph across the table, a faded image of her father, his face half obscured by shadow. "He was a fool," Luca said, "but you're not. Now, cooperate." Her pulse thrummed as she stared at the photo, her mind racing. She wanted to scream, to flee, but his gaze held her in place. Then, as if sensing her hesitation, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing a jagged scar on his wrist, a relic of some long-buried battle. For a heartbeat, something in her softened. She looked away, her jaw tightening. "You don't own me," she hissed. But her voice lacked conviction. He stood, circling the table. "You'll learn to." When he reached for her, she bolted for the door, her coat flapping behind her like a wounded bird. 2 hours later, she stood in the hidden garden path, her breath ragged, the photograph of her father burning in her pocket. The night was cold, the silence between the trees oppressive. She clutched her coat tighter, her mind a battlefield of anger and confusion. Why had he shown her the scar? Was it a warning, a plea, or a trap? Her foot struck a loose stone, and she stumbled, the photograph slipping from her pocket. It landed at her feet, the image of her father staring up at her. She knelt, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. Then, a shadow moved behind her. She spun, but too late. Luca's hands closed around her arms, his grip firm but not cruel. "You're running from this," he said, his voice low. "But you can't." His breath was warm against her ear, and she shivered, not from fear but from something deeper. She wanted to hate him, to fight him, but his presence was a storm she couldn't outrun. "Let go of me," she whispered. He didn't. Instead, he pulled her closer, his chest against her back. "You're not safe with me," he said. "But you're not safe without me either." Her heart pounded, torn between defiance and something she couldn't name. Then, as if the night itself had conspired against her, she felt his fingers brush the scar on his wrist, a silent confession. She turned, her eyes blazing. "Why?" she demanded. But before he could answer, she broke free, sprinting down the path, her breath a ragged whisper in the dark. By the time she reached the fountain, her legs burned, her lungs seared with the effort of escape. But Luca was there, waiting, his silhouette outlined by the pale light. He said nothing, only stepped aside, allowing her to pass. She didn't. Instead, she turned, her chest heaving. "You think you can control me?" she spat. "You think I'll play your game?" His eyes were unreadable, but there was something in them, a flicker of something she couldn't name. "I think you're already playing it," he said softly. "And you don't even know it." The words hung between them, heavy as the silence. Then, as if the night had finally reached its breaking point, he stepped forward, his hand brushing the back of her neck. She didn't pull away. "You're not safe with me," he murmured, his voice a plea. "But I won't let you go." Her breath caught, her heart hammering in her throat. The water of the fountain reflected their faces, fractured and unreadable. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out. But the silence between them was louder. And as the moon climbed higher, the weight of his words settled in her chest, a promise, a threat, and something far more dangerous. The chapter ended with the sound of her own heartbeat, loud and unrelenting, as Luca's fingers lingered on her neck, his whisper still echoing in her ears, "I won't let you go." The storm raged outside the study window as Elena clutched the photo of her father to her chest, her breath shallow, her knuckles white against the glass. Thunder cracked, and lightning split the sky, illuminating Luca's face as he stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the tempest. He hadn't moved. Hadn't touched her. Hadn't spoken. Just watched her, his icy blue eyes locked on hers, as if the world had ceased to exist beyond this room. Her heart thudded in her throat, a wild, frantic rhythm. He was here, here, and the air between them was thick with something that wasn't just anger or fear. It was something darker, something that made her pulse quicken even as her instincts screamed to run. "You think I want this," she whispered, her voice trembling. That I want to be tied to you? His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might answer. But instead, he stepped forward, the scent of his cologne, something smoky and dangerous, filling the room. Her body reacted before her mind could stop it, leaning into him, her lips brushing his in a breathless, desperate kiss. But then she pulled away, her eyes blazing with fury. Don't ever do that again. He didn't move. He didn't speak. Just stared at her, and in that moment, she knew, he was as torn as she was. She fled to the wine cellar, trembling, the cold stone walls pressing in around her as if trying to swallow her whole. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows, and the scent of aged wine and damp earth filled her lungs. Her mind reeled with Luca's kiss, with the way his lips had felt against hers, and the way he had looked at her, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. But that was a lie, wasn't it? He was a monster, a man who had manipulated her, who had used her father's name to control her. Yet, as she pressed her hands against the cold wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps, she felt the ache of something deeper than fear. Longing. Desire. Her father's photo burned in her pocket, and with it, the weight of Luca's demand. You know where he is. The words echoed in her mind, a taunt, a challenge. And yet, her feet moved of their own accord, leading her back toward the study, back toward him. She couldn't stop it. She wanted to stop it. But the truth was, she was already running out of time. The cellar doorway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the storm outside. She stood there, her back pressed against the heavy wooden door, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she heard it, the soft click of the door opening. Luca. His silhouette filled the threshold, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked on hers. You're running out of time, Elena, he said, his voice low, dangerous. You know where your father is. I know you do. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. You don't get to play God with me, Luca. No, he murmured, stepping closer. Then why are you here? Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse under the weight of his gaze. But then, as if some primal force had taken over, she reached for him, her fingers brushing against his chest. I'm not afraid of you anymore, she whispered. And with that, she leaned in, her lips inches from his, the storm raging outside as the world held its breath. Elena's hands trembled as she clutched her phone, the screen glowing with Luca's message, *, your father's alive. You know where he is. *, the words echoed in her skull, a taunt that clawed at the fragile thread of trust she'd allowed herself to believe still existed. She paced the room, her boots scuffing the wooden floor, until her gaze landed on the velvet-lined box beneath her bed. With a sharp inhale, she pried it open, revealing a single silver ring engraved with the Voss crest, her father's ring. Her breath hitched. He was here. He had been here. Her mind raced through the fragmented memories of Luca's scar, his cryptic warnings, the way his voice had softened when he spoke of her father. A cold knot formed in her stomach. Was it all a lie? Her fingers closed around the ring, her pulse roaring in her ears. The door creaked. She froze, her back to the entrance, heart hammering as the scent of gun oil and expensive cologne filled the air. Elena, Luca's voice was low, velvet laced with steel. You found it. She turned slowly, the ring clenched in her fist. You knew he was here, she whispered, her voice trembling. You killed him, didn't you? Elena's fingers trembled around the cold steel of the gun, her breath fogging the air as she stared at Luca's motionless form on the floor of the warehouse. His blood pooled beneath him, a crimson stain that seemed to pulse in time with her racing heart. The body bag from her apartment still sat in the corner, its black plastic taunting her with the weight of her father's ring inside. She had made her choice, kill him, but the moment her finger twitched toward the trigger, his voice cracked through the silence, I never wanted to be your enemy. The words slithered into her mind, unearthing memories of their first meeting, the way his scar had caught the light like a secret. Her resolve wavered as she knelt beside him, the gun still raised, her emerald eyes locking onto the pale, bloodied face of the man who had torn her world apart. "Why?" she whispered, her voice raw. Luca's lips parted, but before he could answer, a distant thunderclap shattered the stillness, and the rain began to fall in sheets against the broken windows. The storm mirrored the chaos in her chest, a tempest of fury and something else, something softer, darker. She had come here to end him, but the storm had other plans. 2 hours later, she stood in the warehouse office, the flickering fluorescent light casting jagged shadows across Luca's face as he sat slumped against the rusted desk. His shirt was soaked through with blood, his wrists bound with frayed rope, but his eyes remained sharp, unyielding. "You should have left me to rot in that cell," he rasped, his voice a broken thing. Elena's jaw tightened as she stepped closer, the gun still in her grip. "You killed my father," she said, her voice a blade. "You orchestrated everything." Luca's laugh was a hollow sound, a ghost of the man she had once found irresistible. "I didn't want to kill him," he said, his voice trembling. "I wanted to protect you. Your father was a monster, Elena. He would have destroyed you." Her breath caught, the words striking her like a physical blow. "You don't get to say that," she hissed. "He was my father." Luca's eyes closed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him. "He was my brother," he whispered. The admission hung in the air, heavy and unbearable. Elena's hand shook, the gun trembling in her grip. "You're lying," she said, but the doubt had already taken root. The storm outside raged on, a mirror to the storm inside her, and for the first time, she wondered if she had been the one blinded by rage all along. The next morning brought a different storm, one of fire and rain as Elena stood on the warehouse floor, the rain slashing against her skin like 1,000 tiny needles. Luca's voice had echoed in her mind all night, his admission of her father's true nature, his claim that he had been her father's brother. The weight of it pressed down on her, a truth she had never known, a betrayal she could not untangle. Her hand hovered over the gun, her heart a war drum in her chest, but her eyes found Luca's, his face pale and unyielding. "You could have told me," she said, her voice hoarse. "You could have stopped this." Luca's lips parted, but before he could speak, the storm outside roared, and a bolt of lightning split the sky. In that blinding moment, she saw him not as the enemy, but as a man who had loved her father in a way she had never understood. Her fingers tightened on the gun, but she did not pull the trigger. Instead, she turned, her footsteps echoing in the rain-soaked silence. "I'll find the truth," she said, her voice a vow. "And I'll decide what to do with it." As she disappeared into the storm, Luca's voice followed her, a whisper lost in the thunder, "I never wanted to be your enemy." 2 hours later, she stood in the Moretti chapel, the air thick with the scent of incense and the weight of unspoken words. The stained glass windows cast fractured light across the marble floor, each shard a mirror reflecting the storm within her. Her fingers tightened around the ivory veil, its fabric whispering promises of purity she no longer believed in. Luca's voice still echoed in her ears, cracked, raw, begging for forgiveness. She had spent the night pacing her apartment, the ring of her father's wedding band cold against her palm, until exhaustion had forced her to surrender to sleep. And yet, the dream had returned, Luca's face, bloodied and broken, pleading with her to stop. Now, as the first light of dawn seeped through the chapel's arches, she stood at the threshold of the altar, the same place where she had first seen him unmasked, unrepentant, and unbearably human. Her breath hitched. The chapel was silent, save for the distant toll of a bell. She had come to kill him. Instead, she was here, wearing a dress that smelled of rose and regret, her heart a warzone of fury and something softer, something dangerous. The doors behind her creaked open. She turned, her green eyes locking onto his. Luca stood in the doorway, his tailored suit dark against the pale light, his hands clasped behind his back as if he had been waiting for her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, those icy blue depths, held the weight of every lie, every betrayal, every twisted love that had brought them here. "You came," he said, his voice a low rumble. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, the veil slipping from her fingers to pool at her feet. The silence between them was a blade, sharp and unrelenting. "I never wanted to be your enemy," he said, his voice breaking. She stared at him, her throat tight. "Then why did you kill him?" The question was a dagger, but her hands did not tremble. "Because I loved him," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. "And because I loved you." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Her breath caught. The chapel seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, she reached for him. "I'm not your enemy either," she whispered. And in that moment, the bells began to ring.